So we know that abortion was just enshrined into Ohio law as of the November election. And something that people often bring up in this conversation is adoption. And we're in no way discouraging adoption. It can be a wonderful opportunity for a child that doesn't have a family for whatever reason. But Lauren, you found an article from Christianity Today that kind of complicates this conversation a little bit more.
Yeah, it's from a adoptive mother. And I really wanted to try to simplify this, but she just has so many good thoughts. So let me start it off with what she says. A few months into the COVID-19 pandemic, after putting my 3 kids to bed, I streamed a National Theater production of Jane Eyre while squeezing in some exercise on her stationary bike. A chill crept through me as I found myself identifying not with Jane, but with her vindictive aunt, who unwillingly becomes Jane's adoptive mother. I was horrified to share Mrs. Reed's resentment towards Jane for being an outsider, an intruder, and a bringer of problems. This was the same sentiment I found myself fighting daily toward our 5-year-old adopted son, whom we'd welcome into our family over a year prior. Watching my own feelings manifested on screen in Mrs. Reed, a villain, it brought home to me how defective my moral compass had become. As a child who always wanted to make the world a better place, I'd taken to heart the value of Christians from the early church and to modern America evangelicals to have placed care for orphans. And the way adoption was portrayed in sermons and on Christian books, I read it was universally positive. Adoption was a metaphor for God grafting us into God's family. You can see Romans 8 and Ephesians 1. Adoption met crucial need. Adoption was a beautiful act of love. Being a gregarious evangelist and on my knees prayer warrior might not be my strength, but welcoming a child, I could do that. When I started dating my future husband, I had just returned from a summer volunteering with disabled children in a Chinese orphanage. Adoption was always a part of how we envisioned we would build our family and extend God's capacious, is that the word? Capacious love to kids in need. After getting married and having 2 biological children with my medical training finally complete and our lives relatively settled, we thought we were prepared. We read books on adoptive parenting. I joined online adoptive forums. We knew other families who had adopted. At the time, critiques of adoption were becoming more prominent. Adult adoptees were advocates rightfully highlighted systemic flaws in both domestic and international adoptions. From corruption to coercion, transracial families' dynamics to legal battles, adopting a child was more fraught than a simple picture I'd been sold in church. Yet I remained convinced that the need of the families was still present, especially among other children with stigmatized medical conditions. So we continued to pursue adoption through a reputable overseas program and agency. We thought, big-hearted people and caring parents. Surely it would be simple to love any child as our own, especially one who shared the same racial and cultural background. So that's her story in the first part. I want to hear from you guys. What have your thoughts on adoption have been just in the church throughout? What have you heard from the church? And maybe what are your own conclusions you've come to about adoption?
One of the unfortunate facets of adoption is that everyone wants babies, but there's lots of older kids that also need loving homes.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I know several families who've adopted, and from the outside, it looks like everything has gone well. But I can feel as she's, starting off the article, oh, maybe this didn't go as well for them.
Yeah, you can feel her tide turning. That didn't go as well. Yeah. Yeah, I think we've often in the church talked about adoption being this wonderful, heroic thing to do, to save children. But I don't think we've talked about often how traumatic it can be for the families that are already intact and for the child that's being adopted. And that's kind of where she's going. There's a lot of people today on, social media and whatever, talking about how adoption is bad and how it shouldn't be, and that it takes all autonomy away from the child and all that kind of stuff.
Really?
Yes, it's very interesting to watch. So she goes on to say, she said, I was convinced that this is what we were supposed to do, that we were great parents, and this was going to be great. Yet the actual experience of introducing our 3rd child, adopted from Taiwan, into our family felt like a bomb going off in our previously peaceful home. He seemed determined to reject our overtures of love and tenderness and make everyone else feel terrible. Feel as terrible as he felt, ripped from his caretakers, his country, and familiar environment. While that's common in adoption, his emotional roller coaster left us exhausted and frayed. I reminded myself constantly that we chose this while our son lacked any agency at all in the situation. He hadn't asked for this, and our other kids hadn't asked for this, and suddenly they had a younger brother who was breaking their toys, stealing their Halloween candy, and deliberately needling them to get a reaction. They had been so sweet in the infant phase, and then there was a flash of lightning. Their lives changed entirely. Our whole family and our home was irrevocably altered. My previously calm and sweet child was banging his head repeatedly on the floor, taking his anger out on himself because he knew he wasn't supposed to hit his new brother. That had happened too. We've seen many therapists. So she's talking about all these challenges. She's had very sweet children that are now having a hard time with this transition of a new child.
Right.
She talks about in the article, she's really trying to give her all to this new child and make sure he feels loved and cared for because he's going through a traumatic situation. He's just been brought over from another country. He's in a totally different family. He's been ripped from the caretakers that he knew.
Yeah.
And so she's giving a lot of care attention to him, but then she has her other children home that are banging their heads on the floor.
Right.
Because they've been through this huge transition.
I can think of, like, when you have children, they're not always the same.
Right.
But if this was your third child, natural born, that's coming home as a baby, as it becomes the very active and maybe antagonistic little sibling, you have time to adapt to it. It's not like the instant that these two kids have, sprung upon them, this wild child,
Yeah.
And it's, I'm not trying to put him down, the adoptee, but it's just a sudden difference.
Yeah, because they adopted a 4-year-old. And so you're just, plopping a 4-year-old and you don't have the 4 years of the older children getting used to this child and, them transitioning slowly. It's not like a slow transition with a biological child. It's like an instant transition. And I think no matter how much pre-counseling you do or counseling once you have the child, there's always going to be that trauma for everybody involved. And so later on, she's shared all that her family's gone through. She said, these dynamics lasted well past the initial months of long adjustment phase. I was prepared for those. In preparation for the adoption, there's classes and, courses and you meet with people to go through it and they talk to you about the long adjustment phase. But she said, 4 years in, I was still in despair.
Oh my.
So she goes on and she's about to turn to her, hey, let's fix this kind of moment. But I want to hear from our listeners. I want to hear your experiences with adoption, international, domestic. What are your thoughts about it? So text any of your thoughts, call in to 440-546-2255. We're talking about a mom who wrote in Christianity Today that adoption was beautiful, precious, and God ordained. And then I adopted. And she's just sharing her story of what her family went through in adoption. So I want to hear your thoughts, hear what your families went through, and how can we as a church better support those in our communities who are going through adoption? So text, call 440-546-2255. Welcome back. We've been talking about adoption. There was a mom who is an adoptive mom, and the title of her article in Christianity Today is Adoption was beautiful, precious, and God ordained, and then I adopted. Before this, we went through all of her, she kind of shares all of the struggles that she went through. She thought that adoption was the most perfect answer, that she was made to do this. Maybe she wasn't going to be a prayer warrior, but she could for sure adopt a kid and bring a family and a kid into her family. And she quickly realized the trauma and pain of adoption, that it's not all fluffy and roses and nice things. And her thoughts on it is that the church should be advocating for adoption. We should be. That's a call in Scripture to care for the orphans and the widows, right? But if you're going to do that, we need to say what it actually is and not just paint it as something nice, that we need to talk about how hard and difficult it is for the biological families as well as the child that's being adopted.
Sort of like we talk about with marriage.
Yes.
That you should be honest with people who are getting married in the premarital counseling.
Yes.
And say, look, it all looks good from the outside, but there's a lot of things you have to work through.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And she talks about the church needs to be adopting, but we need to be more honest about it. So she says, I had valuable friends and spaces and supportive friendships, but that deep seed of shame I kept struggling with as an adoptive parent felt crushing. Since childhood, I was taught that adoption was beautiful, precious, and God ordained. Why didn't it feel that way for me? I needed to unpack the theology that had led me to this place. Often in church spaces, adopting children is compared to God's adoption of us into his spiritual family. But this metaphor, frequently employed without regard for adoption, has changed in the last 2,000 years, sets us up for an unfortunate parallel for the adoptive parents and the child. Our adopted children, especially older kids, experience so much loss and grief in their lives, which manifests as attachment disorders, blocked trust, and trauma responses. We are not God, and we cannot miraculously heal those fissures. So she's saying, it is beautiful and God ordained, but God can heal all wounds, and humanly parents can't. Mm-hmm. And so she's saying the comparison of being adopted into God's family has some flaws to it, if that makes sense. She said, when churches oversimplify adoption, treating it as a glorious reflection of God's plan, as an answer to abortion, or as a form of missions, we distort the complex relationship and set adoptive parents up for failure by putting us in a role that was never ours. Mm-hmm. Adoption is not a panacea. Rather, it is the beginning of a long journey. Churches would do well to present more nuanced and realistic portrait of adoption. While some adoptive families thrive from the start, others feel, maybe, I don't know this word, but I'm going to put in a different word.
Okay.
feel the hardship for years. Reframing how we speak about adoption, recognizing that it originates in brokenness and presenting a range of adoption stories rather than only the easy ones, we better prepare ourselves and prospective parents to normalize the difficulties adoptive families face. So then I asked our listeners to text in your stories of adoption, and the good, the bad, and what you wish maybe the church did better. We had someone text in that said that they have adoptive children and they wish that the church, or they said that the church is not doing enough with kids with issues or with foster parents. We have an adoptive mom of 2 amazing girls and 2 biological sons. My daughters are 18 and 14, and we were able to adopt them as infants. They're international adoptions, and while, of course, it has not been butterflies and rainbows, as there are specific challenges for caring and loving adopted children, raising kids is hard, and the need for adoption exists because of the sinful and broken world we live in, and therefore, we're going to experience the struggle through those consequences as we parent. I think it's important for us as parents, whether biological or adopted, that we think about the long game in parenting, and our goal is to mirror the love and grace of Jesus to our kids. It's really hard.
Okay.
Pulling up another text. Adoption in other countries may not have the same experience. This is just a thought. We have a lot of comforts, and it's hard for kids that can't relate to our world, that feel like they're adopted, that they're a part of their adopted family's experience. It might be like what Julia Slattery was talking about earlier. The women that were being abused could not or did not know how to navigate once they were out of the abuse. So it's ingrained. It's all we know. It may be the same type of transition for kids that are being put into an environment that's so foreign to them. This might be a drastic comparison. Like I said, it's just a thought. And there says, as an adoptee and child protective services worker, I know firsthand about being adopted and advocating for children to be adopted. Adoption's a wonderful thing. I just believe that potential adoptive parents need to be aware of the reality that the children that are being adopted are in troubled positions, which is why they're needing adoption. Try fostering first. The advocates, be it the church or whomever, have to have open and truthful reality about it.
Okay. I like that idea. Try fostering first.
Yeah.
Because you might find something about yourself that you didn't know. And
sure.
You tend to think very well of yourself. Oh, I'm a good mom. I'm a good dad. I could do this.
Yeah.
Well, then you bring a child into your home that's not your child and maybe has some issues or defiance attitude.
Yeah, they have experiences outside of your family.
Yeah.
I think, and to that note, let me add a caveat.
Okay.
Fostering should not be just so that we can adopt this child.
No.
I think if there's a child in the foster system and the parent is working to become a better parent, to be able to parent that child, whether that's finding housing, finding a home, getting through an addiction, our hope would be that they reconcile if the parent is willing and able to parent that child.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just add that caveat there.
Yeah, when it comes to adoption, I think people would do well to get the picture of the quote unquote perfect, happy, normal family out of their minds.
Mm-hmm.
Someone I know from high school adopted 4 children, and she has made every intention to keep her kids in contact with their biological parents.
Mm-hmm.
And she recently posted a picture that her adopted daughter drew, thanking God for her 2 moms. She has her adoptive mom and her biological mother. So I think you just need to accept that there are different challenges. And I think a lot of people look at adoption, for lack of a better term, at least subconsciously, like they're buying a baby. You're also, quote unquote, buying their extended families and all this trauma that they've inherited.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. So at the end of this article, the author says, God calls us to care for the orphans, but God doesn't promise us that it will be easy, and we shouldn't either. So I think kind of summarizing all of her thoughts is that we need to be a little bit more realistic in the church about the struggles of those who are being adopted, the trauma that they're coming from, the experiences that they've had, and how hard of a transition it can be. And also, we need to be better supporters of adoptive parents.
Yeah.
She says in the article, if I had a meal for every time someone told me, oh, I would love to adopt someday, she said I would be fed for life. So maybe actually take them a meal, even if it isn't a new adoption. Maybe they're a couple years down the road. They still need help. They're still going through it. And so maybe we as the church can be better supporters of adoptive families and understand the trauma and just be realistic about it and not just say, oh, but if you're adopting, it's like how God adopts us into his family. That's true. But there are a lot of struggles that adoptive children and parents face. So just some food for thought about adoption. If you want to know more about that article, text us. I'll send you guys the link to that article if you'd like to read it. It's a very good article and just honest. But we're about out of time. So we're going to pass it over to J.D. Greer. We will be back tomorrow.